Carina Edwards, and welcome to episode 22 of the Bible Unmasked. Bible Unmasked is a series where we go through and read the entire Bible. This series is aired every Sunday night at 7:30 on YouTube, and you can also find it being aired on PlantationSDA.tv. And our goal through this series is to read the Bible in its entirety for the whole entire year, for the whole year of 2021. So you can find the reading plan that we read every week. It's shared during the Sabbath service, and you can also find it on our social media and online. I invite you all, inviting you as the viewers, to continue to read with us. Invite your family, your friends, whoever you know, to continue to read the scripture with us every Sunday night, You can also text your questions to 954-380-8780, where the pastors and Principal Stevenson will be coming on every Sunday night and hosting SCA Church's YouTube channel, so you can be notified of any changes, any events, and also any notifications about this series. So I am your co-host tonight, Carina Edwards, and also we have with us Pastor Kevin McKoy. Pastor McKoy?
Pleasure to be with you this evening again, Carina. We're missing Olivia, but I know she's okay, and we're praying for her. But we're still going to have a good time together.
So at this time, wherever you are, we're going to invite the Lord's presence as we go into our study. So I'm going to pray. So please bow your heads with us. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for bringing us together on this Sunday night to learn more about your word and what you have to say to us through your word. I ask that you give us the spirit of discernment as we read throughout the weeks, and as we come together online, virtually, to talk about it. I hope that everyone learns something and we can grow spiritual experience. This is my name, I pray. Amen.
Amen.
So last week, we discussed, I believe it was 2 Chronicles 32 to Nehemiah 7. So Pastor McKoy, can you give us a brief overview of what that was about?
Right. So in 2 Chronicles, we are looking at the kingdom under Solomon. We're looking at how the kingdom was divided. And then we go into Ezra, where we're seeing the beginnings of a return, a reform, as it were, and a rebuilding of God's temple and a reconstitution of God's people as God's chosen covenant people. So we're getting back to Israel in a sense of coming faithful to God and where they should be in a relationship with God.
This week's reading was Nehemiah 8 to Job 12. So Pastor McKoy, again, can you give us a brief overview of what we will be discussing?
Right, so it's a continuation of how Nehemiah steps up as this reformer, this nation builder, and lead the rebuilding of the wall. We're coming into that place, the completion of the building of the wall, and also the dedication, and also the reform that he instituted, the people recommitting themselves to God. Then we find ourselves in Esther, looking at how God spared the people through the witness and the willingness of Esther to put herself on the front lines. And then we begin to come into the place of the wisdom books. We're looking at Job, Proverbs, Psalms, and all that. So we are moving along steadily to the prophets.
So the question is asking, should we confess the sins of our ancestors? Does God forgive our ancestors when we confess their sins?
In this context, the ancestors are referring to most likely people who have passed on, right? People who have died and are off the scene of action. And so when we say we should confess the sin of our ancestors and does God forgive, our ancestors' sins, when we confess their sins, um, we we cannot, in a sense, take responsibility for the confession of sins for our ancestors, because we're going to find that, as we believe that life, life and all its activities um, end with death, and we cannot confess the sins in the sense of confessing and asking for forgiveness for them on their behalf, because they have already passed on. And we don't believe that you can pray away the sins of the dead, right? Um, but something we have to note of importance is when they say, confess, when they are confessing their sins and the sins of their ancestors, it's a recognition of the fact that they have not behaved differently from their ancestors, that there is a similarity between the way the ancestors failed God and they in the present are doing the same and are taking responsibility for the fact that they're failing God, and thus they are confessing their sins. So I don't take it to mean that they are confessing the sins of their ancestors for God to forgive their ancestors' sins, but recognizing that their ancestors made some mistakes, they sinned, and they're seeing that in their own living, and they want to turn away from that kind of ancestral pattern, or pattern that they see in themselves, stringing from coming from their ancestors.
So the next question is taken from Nehemiah 10:31, and it reads, "We will not buy a Sabbath or on a holy day from the neighbor, bring the wares and all fields live fallow every seventh year, and we will cancel every loan." So the question is asking, this passage does not support trading on the Sabbath. Is this one of the reasons why we do not exchange money on the Sabbath?
So, yes to both questions. Well, to the question, we can take this as a reason why we are not exchanging money in the Sabbath, but it goes back to the original reason as to why we observe Sabbath, why we do not exchange money on the Sabbath. Sabbath is more about delighting in God as creator, um, celebrating what God did through the Exodus, and also celebrating what God did at the cross, and also what we look forward to in the future of eternal rest. So those are the reasons we celebrate Sabbath. But yes, we can say that this is one of the reasons we do not exchange money on the Sabbath. But in this context, um, Nehemiah was, as it were, guiding the people in how to observe Sabbath truly, right? Because they were, because of what was happening at the time, right? Um, they needed resources, and these merchants came on, and how it is portrayed is that the merchants are not necessarily Israelites, people who observe the Sabbath, and so Nehemiah has to send those merchants away to not be, as it were, a temptation to the people of God, in breaking the Sabbath and such forth. Um, but he's also encouraging the people of Israel to take responsibility for their commitment um, as Sabbath keeping people, as God's people, to observe the Sabbath as a memorial of creation, the Exodus, and also of the Exodus.
Nehemiah 13, verse 10. "I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and musicians responsible for the service had gone back to their own fields." The question is asking, the Levites were working in the fields because tithe was not being returned. Is this a justification for continuing to return tithe today? Why aren't musicians paid from the tithe like they were in the Bible days?
Right. So if we notice in this account, remember Israel is coming out of captivity and they are rebuilding as a nation. And so the way they used to function before captivity, is not the same. And so there had to be some adjustments to make life work. Notice that even Levites served as guards. Nehemiah had them served as guards. The time and the circumstance called for Levites to function in necessary ways, right? In necessary ways. And so while the people weren't in the promised land and had the opportunity to turn the soil and live and return tithe, because their way of life was disrupted by the captivity. And Nehemiah is trying to bring them back to that place by rebuilding the wall and so forth, so much forth, right? So in a sense, is this a justification for continuing to return the tithe so that the Levite could get paid? Now, I think I answered this question in a similar question to this in a prior episode. But the way the tithe is administered, the way the tithe was administered in the biblical days is not the way it is administered today. The requirement, the principle of returning a tenth remains the same, but how it is administered is different, right? Today, our system our system of governance for the church is not patterned so much after the biblical pattern of how they function around the sanctuary with Levites and priests. It's not the same organization and structure and functioning. But the principle of returning the tithe, a tenth, remains the same. And how it is administered is not the same. So why aren't musicians paid from the tithe like they were in the Bible days? One, structure, functioning is different. And individual churches, even in our denomination, the Seventh Adventist churches function uniquely according to their circumstance on certain matters. And this is a matter that a church board would normally decide. So this depends on the context of whether the church has gifted musicians, does not have gifted musicians. But the administration of the tithe, coming back to the administration of the tithe as to whether musicians should get paid from the tithe, how the tithe is administered today is not how it was administered then. And so now the tithe is administered in a way to advance, if you were, the proclamation of the gospel specifically. Those are the ways it's used, in broadly speaking, right? But as I said, in terms of musicians in local churches and how they are paid or whether they are not they are paid is a matter for a particular church to consider. But notice what Nehemiah did in conclusion on this question. He restored the Levites to their appropriate role, right? If you look in verse 11, so I remonstrated with the officials and said, why is the house of God forsaken? And verse 10, right? I also found out the portion of the Levites had not been given to them, so that the Levites and the singers who had conducted the service of God had gone back to the fields. So for that reason, because the Levites had to work, he remonstrated with the officials and said, why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them and set them in their stations. Right? What does that mean? So he restored the Levites to their service in the temples. Then all of Judah brought the tithe of the grain, wine, and oil in the storehouse. Right? So he restored the Levites to their position. So that's something we also have to recognize that is happening here as a part of Nehemiah's reform of reconstituting Israel as God's people and how they're supposed to function as a covenant community.
Cool. Okay, so the fourth question comes from Nehemiah 13, verse 21 and 24 and 25. But I spoke sharply to them and said, what are you doing out here, camping around the wall? If you do this again, I will arrest you. and that was the last time they came on the Sabbath. Furthermore, half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod or of some other people and could not speak the language of Judah at all. So I confronted them and called down curses on them. I beat some of them and pulled out their hair. I made them swear in the name of God that they would not let their children intermarry with the pagan people of the land. So the question is asking, Nehemiah is cursing the people and using violence. Is this a model for leaders to bring their followers in line? Should we force others to obey God's commands?
Right. So Nehemiah's strategy was kind of forceful, and you'll see that throughout the narrative, the book of Nehemiah. Is it appropriate in all circumstances? A strategy of being forceful. Forcefulness might not be necessary, but um, engaging and encouraging, um, strongly encouraging, I want to say, is a better way. But to the question, should we force people to obey God's commands? Definitely no. Not even God. Not even God forces us to obey God. Obedience is not forced, it is a matter of choice. Right? Obedience to God's commands is a matter of choice. Um, and something to note, how in Nehemiah's reform he is, chiding the people for marrying out of the people of God, or intermarrying with pagans. Now, Nehemiah and Ruth differ on this point. Notice it was through marrying, if you were a pagan, it was an intermarriage of pagans, in a sense, in Ruth, that there was some kind of redemption, if you were, because remember, Ruth wasn't an Israelite, but Boaz was, right? So I just want to bring that point I just wanted to bring that to say that Nehemiah in his reform, when they are out of a difficult circumstance, can emphasize this. But notice when Israel was in a difficult place, the famine and all of that and stuff in terms of the book of Ruth, which we went through, we saw how that became a way for God's people to survive, and even for King David to come on, for Jesse to come on the scene, and for King David to come on the scene, as we spoke about there. But something of importance, Nehemiah's efforts here are to preserve cultural and the cultural and religious heritage, right? Because his challenge was that the people are not, that the children are not speaking the language of Judah. That's a cultural heritage there, right? And the religious heritage there, speaking about also the intermarrying with pagans and stuff. So his aim in this part of his reform is to preserve the Jewish cultural and religious identity as a people of God.
Right. So you're saying it was more so like a part of a part of the set of people, their identity, and that's why he was so forceful in it. And not necessarily because more like today, it's more so choice, and God wants you to choose. Got you.
Right.
I can see that. The next question is taken from Esther chapter 2, verse 15 to 17. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So the question is asking, the king was pleased with Esther and made her queen. Did she have to be intimate with him before they were officially married? If she wasn't chosen, would she have been considered immoral for having violated her purity with someone who was not her husband? That's a good question.
Right. Good question. And here's how we're going to start to answer this one. So when we look in the chat in Esther chapter 2, one of the things we see is some historical details about the narrator gives us a vision or a recollection of how things process, of how these women were prepared to go in the king's presence, and what happened and how the king related to them. Now, based on verses 12 to 14, which I'm going to read again, which you read, there is a suggestion that intimacy is a part of the process, right? There's a suggestion. Let me read it. Verse 13. When the girl went into the king, she was given whatever she asked for to take with her from the harem to the king's house. 14. In the evening she went in, and then in the morning she came back to the second harem in the custody of the king's eunuch. There is a suggestion of intimacy as a part of the process of the king choosing his wife. But look at what verse 15 says. Verse 15 says, when the turn came for Esther, right, who had and spoke about Modacai, listen what it says. She asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised her. So the suggestion again is that she used wisdom. A part of her process is in becoming and being chosen to be the queen is she used wisdom. She took advice from the eunuch. We are not privy to what that advice is, but the suggestion based on the narrative is that a part of why she was chosen is she applied wisdom in her dealings with the king, right? And she didn't ask for anything except what she was advised to do. So that comes across as she using wisdom in the process of being chosen. But not only that, verse 17 and still in verse 15 speaks about her beauty and how that gave her favor in the king's sight. So where I'm going to is this. Though there's a suggestion that intimacy is a part of the process of being chosen, there's also a suggestion that Esther used wisdom and her beauty to gain favor with the king, which in the narrative line is seeming to suggest that she didn't have intimacy with the king. Now, these are all narrative things that are happening. There's nothing specific in it, but these are suggestive. One, that intimacy is a part of the process for all the girls, but when it comes to Esther, especially, there's a sense that she used wisdom and her beauty to gain favor with the king, and thus she was chosen. That's the best I can say. Whether there was intimacy or not, it is a suggestion, but it's not specifically stated as such. So to the second part of the question, if she wasn't chosen, would she have been considered immoral or having violated her purity with someone who was not her husband? Yes, it would have been considered immoral, because obviously she wasn't married to the king, and even if in the sense that she was chosen by the king, if she had intimacy with the king before she got married, it would still have been some sense of immorality. There will be immorality in that too. So yes, no doubt about that. But how dealing with Esther as to whether or not she was intimate or not with the king, it's a suggestion, but what is evident is that her wisdom and beauty brought her favor with the king. That is evident from the passage.
Makes sense. Okay, so the next question is also from Esther. Esther chapter 3. It's about Haman's plot against the Jews. The question asks, was Haman's hatred for the Jews limited to his hatred of Mordecai, or was it based on his descendants having a rift with Israel?
I think it's based on the fact that is a Jew. I'm not sure of there being a rift between Israel and Haman's descendants, but it's evident that there is some, in our time we call it anti-Semitism, right? There's a sense of that because Mordecai tells Esther to conceal the fact that she is Jewish. Now, we aren't given much details as to why that is, but we can read in the larger story in that Israel, the Israelites were if you were the hated underdogs, right? And if her identity as a Jew was revealed, it would have somehow disqualified her or prevented the process from going forward. So the wisdom of Mordecai telling her not to reveal her identity as a Jewish person suggests that there is some anti-Semitism happening. Whether it's because of the hatred of Jews in total or descendants rift, it's not specifically stated, but there is hatred definitely toward the Jewish people.
Next question is from Esther chapter 3, as well, verse 7. And it says, "So in the month of April, during the 12th year of King Xerxes' reign, lots were cast in Haman's presence. The lots were called Purim, which determined the best day and month to take action. And the day selected was March 7th, nearly a year later." So the person is basically asking you if you could please explain what this verse means.
All right. So prior to, in the previous verses, we are seeing the plot, right? We are seeing the plot being devised to destroy Mordecai and the Israelite people. In this specific verse, we are seeing them considering the date for that to begin enacting that, right? So they're looking at the calendar and they're casting a lot to determine which day should it specifically be. Now, notice that the date that was chosen, right, even in their casting of lots, their plans turned out to be God's plan. And we're going to see what I mean by that. It gave Esther time to be crowned queen and also to save the Jewish people. Now, if they had, so the time in which they planned, it was a year's time, right? If they had planned for a shorter period of time, possibly Esther couldn't have been crowned, because remember the process for the women to go in to the king took approximately a year. In being perfumed, in being oiled, it took them about 1 year from being brought into the eunuch to being carried into the king's presence. And at the same time, the narrative showing that they are planning to destroy the Israelite people when God was already bringing Esther into the picture at the same time. So their plan actually turned out to be a part of God's plan, if you please. Work in the will, in the sphere of God's ultimate and divine plan.
The next question, it comes from Esther chapter 4, and it's regarding Mordecai persuading Esther to help him. The question is asking, since Malachi had to challenge Esther to do what was right, was she really the hero of the story? So I think I'm not sure if if the person was referring to Malachi or Mordecai in this
I think it's
sense.
Mordecai. Yeah, I think it's Mordecai.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to find a wonderful example for this. In life, we are always going to have persons with more wisdom, more experience that can give us guidance. And that's what we see happening in this, right? Mordecai is portrayed as this Israelite of wisdom and experience, guiding his relative. That doesn't diminish Esther's role in the narrative. And so if we're going to talk about a heroine of the story, yes, she has that role, because she, her name, Esther, means, to hide. Esther means to hide. But notice what happens in the story. She takes the encouragement. She didn't have to take the encouragement, right? Or she didn't have to stand up to the challenge of Mordecai. But her name mean Esther, being to hide. She comes forward out of hiding and stands in the gap for her people. And so she does have a prominent role in the story, being the heroine of the story, which is not diminished by the encouragement, the guidance given to her by Mordecai. And if you please, Mordecai is the hero of the story, and Esther is the heroine of the story.
Esther chapter 6, verse 13. When Haman told his wife Zeresh that all his friend what had happened, his wise advisers and his wife said, "Since Mordecai, the man who has humiliated you, is of Jewish birth, you will never succeed in your plans against him. It will be fatal to continue opposing him." And the question is asking, can people succeed at persecuting Christians?
Um, the history of Christianity suggests that Christians have indeed been persecuted. But what is significant, I notice Jesus said in the Beatitudes, he spoke about those being persecuted, right? And that they will be blessed. Blessed are they when they persecute you for all manner of evil. And I don't remember the verse verbatim. But the idea is, being a Christian doesn't mean, the text didn't say, Jesus didn't say, blessed are those who escape persecution, right? And not to say that those who escape are not blessed, but the idea is God vindicates those who are persecuted, and that's how they become blessed, referring to the beatitude of Jesus, right? So the history of Christianity details how Christians have been persecuted, become food for lions and candles to light the dark night. It's there. The history tells a story. But something that the story of Mordecai tells us is that God vindicates those who are persecuted unjustly. That's the message of Mordecai, relating to Mordecai in the story.
Okay, we're going to jump to Job, the book of Job. So the first question from Job comes from chapter 1, verse 6. This is the New Living Translation. One day the members of the heavenly court came to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser, Satan, came with them. Then the Lord asked Satan, "Have you noticed my servant Job? He is the finest man in all the earth. He is blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and stays away from evil." The question is asking, why did God single out Job to Satan like that? It feels like God was playing games with Job's life. How else could we see this?
One, God singled out Job because of his qualities as described, right? He is blameless and a man of complete integrity. Now, if you're really going to test somebody, let me say this first. Now, the big theme around the book of Job, the book of this wisdom book, is why bad things happen to good people, right? And so for that theme to come forward, and another thing that it's talking about is whether or not virtue operates on the principle of reward and punishment, right? Going back kind of to Deuteronomy, and the blessings and the curses. If you're good, you are blessed. If you sin, you get punishment. So there's a play and an allusion to that there, right? But why did God single out Job? One, his qualities. If you are gonna test any principle or quality, you need the best product sample, right? And Job stands out as the best product sample for God, about faithfulness to God in the midst of difficulties, or faithfulness to God, responding to the question of why bad things happen to good people, right? Job stands out as this ultimate example of blamelessness and integrity. And the accuser Satan is going to put God's theory to the test, as it were, and put this theory to the test as to whether or not virtue depends on the principle of reward or punishment. You're blessed because you do good. You're blessed, or you're good because you're blessed, and punishment and reward. Yeah.
Yeah, because I know growing up, like Job was a really hard story for me. Like I couldn't get past it because it's like it just seemed to me like God was trying to prove a point. Like, what about Job's life? Like, what about him and his family? Like, it's like you wanted to prove a point at the expense of like one of your children. Like, and it just
Yeah.
never rubbed me the right way. It just never
Yeah.
rubbed me the
Yeah.
right
It's
way.
a yeah. You were right to name that. It's a tough one. Um, and here's why Job is so significant. The character of Job is so significant. If a blameless person of complete integrity can experience all these horrors, what kind of God is this? Right? Who is this God? And does it make sense if you live blamelessly and complete integrity, if even when you're good, you still experience evil? So those are some of the things that are happening in the story, and we're going to see how God responds to that. We see how God responds to that in giving Job double, of what was taken away from him. Jumping ahead of the story.
Okay. Another question from Job chapter 2, verse 1. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord. Question is asking, this verse mentions other sons of God coming to represent their various worlds. Does this mean there are other living creatures on other planets?
From the spirit of prophecy, there is an assertion that there are other worlds. Um, there is an assertion that there are other worlds, other planets, other beings, and even from this text itself would suggest that these sons of God are representatives of gods to the various planets, and the Satan comes in to play an accusatory role in testing the relationship between the peoples of these planets and the God, the God. So it seems as the way it's portrayed, as if there's convened this council. There's this council that representatives comes from each planet, and this council is convened to examine how the relationship of these people in relation to the God of the universe.
Next question, Job chapter 2, verse 6 and 7. All right, do with him as you please, the Lord said to Satan, but spare his life. So Satan left the Lord's presence, and he struck Job with terrible boils from head to foot. The question is asking, how powerful is Satan? Why did God allow Satan to attack Job, who was blameless?
How powerful is Satan? Satan, the story is, it's obvious from the story that Satan has enough power that God allows. Satan has the latitude that is granted, this, to function in the sphere of the latitude of power that God gives. So what Satan is able to do is what God allows to happen. It goes back to the fact that God is the sovereign being of this universe, right? Who has control over all things. And I said this, I think, in another episode when we were in Deuteronomy, how evil comes about as the cause by reason of disobedience. In this, Satan is merely functioning as an accuser, and testing the limits or the strength of Job's relationship with God. Did I answer the question fully? Is there a part that I left out?
Yes. No,
Okay,
you answered the question. I was
throw it back
just
to
like
me then.
had like other I just had like another comment because like I know we always like talk about in church that God is this all powerful, all controlling,
Hmm.
benevolent, omnipresent being, this deity that
Right.
exists outside of us and et cetera, et cetera. And so like there's so many like philosophical arguments that talk about the fight between God and, you know, Satan or the antagonist. And it's like I can see like certain arguments in terms of like if God is all powerful, all controlling, he created everything, right? Then some people say like that means that he created evil. And if he didn't create evil, and evil came in and obstructed his whole perfect plan, then that means that he's not a perfect God and he is not all controlling. And that, so
Mm,
there's like so many arguments that go into that whole philosophical thing. And it's so like, it's mind boggling to like think about those things, you know?
right, right. So,
Yeah.
so,
So,
Job, Satan's attacks at Job functioned as a temptation to sin. And by sin, I mean for Job to lose faithfulness, um, and to lose his blamelessness and integrity with God, right, as an individual. Because remember, he was blameless. So this idea of boils and stuff come upon him, it's like, okay, if God's doing this to me after based on who I am, then I should. And we're gonna come to that in another way, right? Then I should just, why am I keeping faith with this God? Why am I remaining faithful to this God? But Job holds on, right? And overcome what would seem like a temptation to sin with these boils and over his body, right? But it's a test of Job's relationship with God.
it is very true. Okay, next question. It comes from Job chapter 3, verse 3. Let the day of my birth be erased, and the night I was conceived. So the question is asking here, Job wants to erase the day of his birth. Is he seeking to literally change the calendar?
No, he's not seeking to change the calendar. He is reflecting on. It's as if it's as if he is saying, "I wish I did not exist." Based on all that I'm going through, I wish I did not exist because it's so much. So it's not necessarily literally about the day. Well, it's about the day he was born, he was conceived, but it's more about his existence. He was going through an existential crisis, and he was like, if I didn't exist, this wouldn't be happening to me. And so then I
Right,
wish I
right.
did not exist. So that's kind of where Job is placing his thinking.
Job 5, verse 17. But consider the joy of those corrected by God. Do not despise the discipline of the Almighty when you sin. The question is, just like Eliphaz, I believe I'm pronouncing it right, people may assume that we have sinned and are being disciplined by God when we are going through trials. What should we tell them and do in these circumstances?
Uh, Two things. One, if they are functioning like Eliphaz, if they are functioning like him, then they are wrong too, because he turned out to be kind of wrong. People assume that we have sinned and are be disciplined when we are going through trials. Job didn't necessarily did anything wrong because he was blameless, complete integrity. So the assumption that we are going through something because we sinned, if someone assumes that, then they are in the same place as Eliphaz, where they are thinking is wrong. And what should we do? We should do like Job, or at least in certain places like Job. We should remain faithful to God. Trials come and go, but our faithfulness to God should be constant and consistent. And so that's what we should do. We don't have to get into a war of words, whether or not as to we are sinners, or if it's because we're sinful or whatever we're experiencing this. Our duty in that moment is to remain faithful to God, regardless of what we are going through.
Right. And I think that's the overall theme of the story of Job too. Like no matter what, just staying faithful. I mean, it's a kind of a hard read, but I think that's the theme. Um,
Right.
Job 6, verse 29 is, "Stop assuming my guilt, for I have done no wrong." The question is asking, Job insisted that he was innocent and didn't do anything wrong. But aren't we all sinners?
Job was accused of being guilty for sins which he did not commit. Now, while those accusations are wrong, it doesn't mean that Job was flawless, or, well, it did say that he was blameless and complete, in his integrity, right? But in terms of us all being sinners, no one is faultless or flawless. Um, Bible, the word of God says all of us have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And being descendants of our foreparents, Adam and Eve, all of us partake of that sinfulness, and that's why we all need Jesus. And so, yes, in Job, the sins he was accused of, he was innocent of those things, but that doesn't mean that he was, or any of us are sinless in totality or in who we are as human beings.
Job chapter 2, verse 9, it says, "His wife said to him, 'Are you still trying to maintain your integrity? Curse God and die.'" The question is asking, Job's friends gave him hope, while his wife told him to curse God. Can a friend be more supportive than a spouse? How can we find a healthy balance between our friendships and marriage? Is one more important than the other?
All right, so let me zoom in specifically on verse in chapter 2 9. Job, and we're going to relate it to his friends and stuff. Notice that Job's wife echoed God's evaluation of Job. God said Job is blameless and a person of complete integrity. In this instance, she's doing that. Are you still going to maintain your integrity? She's saying that he's the man of integrity. So that is to be noted, right? So while it might seem like his friends were giving him hope and his wife wasn't giving him hope, we have to notice that she was affirming his character as being one of integrity. So that's something we have to pay attention to. Two, her thought of him giving up his integrity and cursing God and die comes from a sense of frustration of the fact that Job is a man of integrity, but yet still he is experiencing this misery, right? So her question then is, her thought then is, there is no connection between being virtuous and being rewarded, right? Because if you are virtuous and still experiencing misery, what's the sense of remaining virtuous? What's the sense of returning your integrity? If you're gonna have integrity and suffer, it's best to die. It's best to die and stuff, because there's no positive connection. It doesn't make sense. She's actually saying, I'm good, but I'm experiencing misery. Well, if you give up your integrity, it can't be worse. It's either you die. That's it. That's kind of her thought, right? But going into the question, right? Did she not give me any hope or anything like that? Was she doing better or worse? Was she doing worse than his friends were? I don't necessarily think so. And the question, can a friend be more supportive than a spouse? Here's how I want to respond to that. Yes, a friend can be more supportive than a spouse. It's possible. There's potential for that to be the case. But here's how I want to balance that. Here's how I want to put a caveat on that. The caveat comes in how we balance the relationship and between friendship and whether one is important or the other. So here's what I want to say about this. A friendship is important to the extent that it supports your marriage, right? A friendship is important or significant or beneficial to the extent that it supports your marriage. Here's what I mean. Is your friend a friend of your relationship? This is the kind of question I would use to evaluate this question of the importance of friendship and the balance between friendship and marriage, right? Is your friend a friend of your marriage? Is your friend wanting the best for the marriage that you have with your particular spouse? In that case, if it is yes, your friend wants you and your relationship to flourish and to grow, then yes, that friendship is significant. But it is still not more important than your marriage. Your marriage supersedes any friendship. A matter of fact, marriage is the most important friendship. Or you can say it away, friendship in marriage is the most significant friendship, right? So that's how I would respond to that there, right? So in Job's wife's case, it's not as if she was all being all doom and gloom. She was really thinking through something. She was thinking through the theme of the book of Job, right? If you are virtuous, if you are a man of integrity, but you are still suffering, why remain alive and suffering and suffer for being good? You're a good person. Why is bad happening to you? Right? Give up this goodness thing and die, because it doesn't make a difference. That's kind of her reasoning, and her reasoning is worthwhile. It's meaningful reasoning because it follows kind of the theme of the book, the exploration, the wisdom that we are gleaning from the book, right? So her thought is, if there's no positive connection between the virtue of integrity and reward, give up. So she's not taking away all hope from Job. She is giving him a way out of the misery that he is experiencing. That's her thought process that she was going through. As she observes his loss and the pity and the shame and the pain that he's going through, it was a loving, it can be seen or read as a loving response to a person who is suffering, right? Because if someone is suffering, we don't go to them and say, continue to suffer, continue in your suffering, or suffering is God's will for you, or something like that. She was really thinking compassionately about the situation her husband was going through. That's how at least I want to think about it.
Well, thank you, Pastor McKoy, for joining us tonight. Viewers, those of you who are watching, I invite you guys next week to read through Job 13 to 42, and you can text your questions to the same number, and that number is 954-388-8780. So I encourage you guys to read daily and not all at once, so you can really absorb all of the material, because I know it's a lot to learn all at once. Next week's presenters are going to be Pastor Paul and Lenny Anderson, excuse me. So, Pastor McKoy, can you tell our viewers what they should be expecting in Job 13 to Job 42 next week? Can you give them a little idea?
Well, so we are going to explore the in details and in a serious way whether or not Job is actually sinless or blameless or faultless or flawless. And the question is going to be answered, why bad things happen to good people. And we're going to see God's justice. We're going to see God's character and quality come forward in how God blesses Job because of how Job went through the experience of suffering. We're gonna see some of that happening there.
Okay. So, viewers, again, thank you so much for tuning in with us. Thank you, Pastor McKoy, for joining us and answering a lot of these very interesting, hard questions. Remember, viewers, that you can always get notified of anything that is going on in the events and this series, any upcoming news about this series, if you subscribe to Plantation SDA's YouTube channel. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Pastor McKoy.
Let us pray. God of wisdom, sovereign God, we know that your will is beyond our comprehension. We cannot advise you. We weren't there when you created the world, when you threw the stars into being. And so we do not have full view of your workings. And because of our limited understanding, sometimes we think that, God, you're not functioning in the way you should. But as we continue through this book of Job and onwards through this study, we realize that all we need to do is to remain faithful to you, because your will and providence supersedes all that happens in our lives and in this world. So give us the willingness, give us all that it takes to submit and to be faithful to you, regardless of all that we go through. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.